In the stillness of early morning, before the rest of the world had bothered to rouse itself, Mr. Clayton's old screen door creaked open. He stepped outside into his backyard in Lexington, Kentucky, a place where each blade of grass seemed to remember the hush of better days. The sun was just barely up, throwing soft golden light across the neat rows of rose bushes lining the weathered fence. The air was tinged with dew and the faint bittersweet perfume of blooming roses. Her roses, June's roses. He reached for the battered watering can, careful not to wake the robins nesting under the eaves. Clayton was a man who moved with the measured slowness of someone who had outlived most of his ambitions, and almost all of his routines. His hands, large and calloused from years as a mechanic, gripped the can as if it held something far more precious than just water. He spoke quietly, sometimes to himself, sometimes to the silent memories swirling around him. The ritual never changed. Check the buds, pinch away a browning leaf, measure just the right amount of water for each plant. As he moved down the row, he glanced up, almost unconsciously, toward the far end of the fence, and there she was, like clockwork, the rough collie, always in the same spot, always watching. Her fur caught the morning light, a blend of caramel and white, making her seem almost luminous against the dull gray of the old wooden fence. The first morning she'd shown up, Clayton had dismissed her as a stray, maybe lost or bored. But she didn't act lost. She didn't bark, didn't whine. She just watched, her dark eyes following him, head tilted slightly to one side in perpetual curiosity. Now, weeks later, it felt like she had always been there, her presence as steady as the sunrise, as constant as the ache in his knees. He eyed her over the top of his glasses and grumbled, Back again, huh?" His voice was gravelly, more a sound than a question. The collie didn't move, except for a slow wag of her tail. She sat, regal and patient, just a few feet from where the roses met the fence. Clayton shook his head, but he didn't chase her off. He never did. There was a sort of unspoken truce between them, an understanding as fragile as the petals he tended each morning. She'd stay on her side, and he'd stay on his. That was the rule. But every now and then, their eyes would meet, and something wordless would pass between them, a sense that perhaps neither of them truly belonged on just one side of the fence. As the days stacked up, each much like the one before, Clayton's world shrank to the size of his backyard. He barely left the house, except to buy groceries or run an errand he couldn't put off any longer. He ignored phone calls, let mail pile up. He'd turned down every invitation from neighbors, backyard barbecues, Sunday church, even just a wave and a "how you doing" from over the fence. His family, if you could still call it that, had scattered long ago. The only thing that seemed to notice whether he showed up each morning was this dog, the collie. He hadn't asked her name. It didn't seem right to ask. Names were for people you planned to keep. Yet every morning, she was there. As the sun pulled itself higher in the sky, the collie would sit in that same patch of grass, tail gently brushing the ground, ears pricked up at the sound of Clayton's voice. Some days he muttered curses under his breath about the squirrels, or about the stubbornness of aphids. Some days he said nothing at all. And every day, she waited. One morning, as he knelt beside the roses, he noticed the collie was closer to the fence than usual, close enough that he could see the pattern of white fur on her chest, the flecks of gray around her muzzle, signs that she, too, was not as young as she once was. She rested her chin on her paws, eyes never leaving him. "Got nothing better to do, huh?" he mumbled, not unkindly. She only blinked, as if she understood patience in a way that humans never quite did. It became a dance, this routine. He'd water, she'd watch. He'd sigh, she'd settle. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch steps, cup of coffee in hand, and catch himself looking over, expecting her. On the rare morning she didn't show up right away, a small thread of worry crept in, tugging at something inside him he'd thought was gone. But she always came, eventually. And somehow that mattered. Clayton started to notice things. The way the collie's ears perked when he talked about his roses, the faint limp she carried on rainy days, the fact that she was never dirty, never hungry looking. Somebody was taking care of her. Somebody must have loved her. He wondered who. He wondered why she preferred the company of an old man and his roses to whatever home waited for her on the other side. Some days he found himself talking a bit more, his voice warming as he described the color of a new bloom, or muttered a story about June, how she'd always accused him of overwatering, how she'd hum while weeding the flower beds. He didn't know why he bothered, except that the collie listened, and the garden felt less empty with her there. Once, as the wind shifted and the world seemed to hush for just a moment, Clayton looked at the collie and whispered, "You ever lose someone, girl?" The collie's tail thumped once, slow and soft, as if she understood. He smiled, just a hint, the first in a long time, and as the morning slipped quietly into day, the old man and the dog sat on opposite sides of a weathered fence, sharing a silence that somehow was no longer lonely. There are days when the house feels smaller than it really is, like the walls are inching closer, pinching him from all sides. Clayton sits in his kitchen, the table covered in yesterday's mail, today's newspaper, and a mug stained by too many cups of coffee. He stares at the calendar on the fridge, a cheap one from the hardware store, still open to June, even though it's now late September. He hasn't bothered to flip the page. The photo is of blue hydrangeas, a flower June once tried to grow but never could. Wrong soil, she used to say, her hands always covered in earth. The silence in the house is heavy, but it's a familiar weight. It's been nearly 5 years since June passed. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like a different life. Like maybe it happened to someone else. Her shoes still sit by the door. Her gardening gloves hang by the sink. He can't bring himself to throw them out, though the leather has stiffened and the fabric's gone gray from dust. He tells himself it's about respect, about not rushing grief. But deep down he knows it's about fear. He's afraid of how empty the house might feel if her things were truly gone. His children, well, he hardly thinks of them as his anymore. They call on holidays sometimes. They send birthday cards with cheery, guilt-tinged messages and gift cards for restaurants he never visits. They live far away, have their own lives and families, their own problems. And sometimes he wonders if he pushed them away or if they just drifted out of his orbit or away. Maybe it doesn't matter. He's learned to live without the sound of their voices bouncing down the hallway. He refuses the invitations from his neighbors, though they keep trying. The Simmons next door knock every other Sunday, inviting him to church or to backyard cookouts. You know where we are. If you ever need anything, Mr. Clayton, Mrs. Simmons says, her smile just a little too hopeful. He nods, promises to think about it, and closes the door before the loneliness in her voice can touch him. He doesn't go to the community center anymore, not since June died. The thought of joining a group, playing bingo, or eating potluck casseroles with strangers is unbearable. They would ask questions, offer empty condolences, suggest he move on. He can't bear to explain that he doesn't want to move on. Not really. All he wants is quiet and routine, and the sound of his own footsteps in the hall. Most days his world is as small as his backyard. The rows of roses, the cracked patio, the battered wooden fence that marks the edge of his kingdom. Some mornings he forgets what day it is until he sees the garbage truck, the mail carrier, or the collie's patient silhouette waiting by the fence. She's become the only marker of time he really trusts, as reliable as sunrise and sunset. The garden is his haven. He spends hours there, pruning, weeding, and talking to the flowers. And sometimes he talks to June as if she's standing beside him, her laughter echoing in the rustle of leaves. "You always said the roses were too much work," he mutters, snipping away a wilted bloom. "But look at them now. Best thing he ever been. He tries not to think about why that is. Maybe it's because he puts more of himself into the soil now. More of his longing, more of his memories. He doesn't know when he started, waiting for the collie each morning, but now it feels strange when she isn't there right away. Her presence has become a gentle constant, like the steady ticking of the clock above the kitchen sink. He wonders who she belongs to, what her life is like when she's not watching him tend his roses. He imagines she has a family, children who throw sticks and parents who sneak her table scraps, but then, why does she spend so much time with him, an old man who barely speaks? Sometimes he feels silly talking to her, but it's easier than talking to people. The collie listens, doesn't judge, doesn't interrupt with platitudes or suggestions. He finds himself telling her things he hasn't told anyone. How the nights are the hardest. How the house feels too big and too empty. How some days he can barely remember the sound of June's voice. The collie just watches, tail thumping gently against the ground, eyes soft and understanding. His routine has become sacred: coffee at dawn, roses before breakfast, a slow walk around the yard. He makes a point of leaving the kitchen window open so he can hear the world outside. The birds in the trees, the children riding their bikes, the faint bark of dogs a block away. Sometimes he hears the collie's quiet whine or the gentle scrape of her paws against the fence. It comforts him, knowing she's there, even when he can't see her. He tries to keep the rest of the world at arm's length. He ignores the phone when it rings. He lets the mail pile up until the stack threatens to topple. He avoids the supermarket, preferring the corner store, where the cashier knows not to ask about June or the kids. He wears the same flannel shirt most days, the one with the elbows worn thin and the faint scent of engine oil still clinging to the cuffs. One afternoon, as he trims the hedges, Mrs. Simmons calls out from her porch, waving a container of soup. It's chicken noodle, homemade. You should come over for dinner, Mr. Clayton. Rosie would love the company, too. She gestures at the collie, who perks up at the sound of her name. Clayton hesitates, feeling the old tug of guilt. He almost says yes, but the words stick in his throat. Maybe another time, he calls back, forcing a smile. He turns back to his roses, feeling the collie's gaze on him, steady and patient. When the sun sets, he sits on the back steps, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to the world wind down. The collie is still there, a quiet sentinel at the edge of his yard. He wonders what she sees when she looks at him, a man who has retreated so far into himself that even the sound of laughter feels foreign. Maybe she sees someone who is just as lost as she is, someone who needs a friend but doesn't know how to ask for one. The light fades, the roses cast long shadows across the lawn, and the collie finally stands, stretches, and disappears into the gathering dusk. Clayton sits for a long time after she's gone, the memory of her presence lingering like the scent of the last rose of summer. That night, as he locks up and shuffles off to bed, he pauses by the window, half hoping to see her silhouette against the fence. The yard is empty, but he knows she'll be back. She always is. And for the first time in a long while, he feels a small flicker of anticipation for the morning. A reason to open the door, step outside, and greet whatever the day might bring. The next morning dawned with the promise of rain, gray clouds dragging their bellies low across the Lexington sky. Clayton stood at his kitchen sink, sipping his coffee and watching the backyard darken, the roses gathering droplets like tiny pearls along their leaves. It was too wet for birds, too gloomy for neighbors to be out. But as he stepped onto the porch, he found the collie, unbothered by the weather, sitting in her usual spot, by the fence. He shook his head, almost amused. "Not even rain keeps you away, huh?" he said, the words coming easier than they used to. The collie flicked her ears, tail tapping the damp grass, eyes trained on him with quiet expectation. Clayton lingered longer than usual by the back door, the warmth of the house tempting him to stay inside. But something about the dog's calm patience called him out. He pulled his old windbreaker tight and walked across the yard, shoes sinking into the soft earth. He could feel the silence pressing in, heavy with the unsaid. The garden seemed smaller beneath the swollen clouds, colors dulled, air thick and electric. But the dog's presence made it feel less empty, less like a mausoleum and more like a waiting room, somewhere a new chapter might begin, if only he let it. His morning chores were slow today. The rain meant no watering, just a careful check for black spot and slugs. He grumbled to the roses, running his thumb over a pale yellow bud about to open. Behind him, the collie waited, not moving, simply watching every step. When he finished, he wandered to the kitchen, poured himself another mug of coffee, and grabbed the end of an old loaf of bread he'd taken to feeding the sparrows and robins every morning, a habit that seemed both pointless and strangely comforting. Standing at the porch, he tore the bread into pieces, tossing it across the grass where the birds usually gathered. Today they were slow to come. Maybe the rain, maybe the collie's presence. Clayton glanced at her. Noticed how she watched the breadcrumbs fall, head tilted in that now familiar way. Her ears perked as a sparrow fluttered by, but she made no move to chase it. He felt a sudden urge to test something, to break the silent treaty they'd kept at the fence. He tore off a slightly larger piece of crust and, with an exaggerated flick, tossed it toward her. It landed just a few feet from her nose. The collie hesitated, as if unsure whether this was an invitation or a trick. She sniffed the air, eyes flicking to Clayton for permission. He gave a half shrug. "Go on. It's not poisoned," he muttered. She crept forward, graceful even on the slick grass, and took the crust gently in her teeth. Instead of gobbling it, she sat and chewed slowly, savoring the taste. Clayton watched, feeling something tight in his chest loosen just a little. He repeated this small act the next morning, this time offering a bit of deli meat he'd saved from his own lunch. "Don't tell your people, but this is the good stuff," he said, tossing a piece over. The collie's eyes brightened. She caught the meat in midair, swallowing it with a practiced snap. The days that followed found Clayton looking forward to these exchanges. Each morning the offerings grew more generous: an old biscuit, a slice of ham, a few bits of roast chicken. The collie accepted them all, always politely, never begging or barking. If she wanted more, she never showed it. Her manners reminded him of June's old rule about never feeding dogs from the table. He smiled at the memory. "You've got better manners than half the folks I used to know," he joked, more to himself than to her. That evening, as the rain drummed lightly on the roof, Clayton sat alone in his living room. The house was quiet, the clock ticking on the wall, his dinner left mostly untouched. He stared at the empty chair across from him, where June once sat, talking about her day, or chiding him for his bad habits. The ache was sharp and familiar. He thought of the collie, the way she waited at the fence, patient and expectant. Without meaning to, he found himself speaking to the room. "That dog, she's got more sense than most people. I'll give her that," he said, voice echoing a little in the emptiness. "Oh, knows when to keep quiet, too." As the days stretched on, the collie became a fixture in his routine. She was always there at first light, no matter the weather: fog, rain, even the rare Kentucky snow. Neighbors came and went, their children shouting and playing in the street, but none ever approached the fence. Only the collie seemed drawn to Clayton's world, as if she understood what he needed, or maybe what she needed herself. He started leaving out scraps just for her, setting a plate by the fence with a quiet nod, pretending it was for the birds. Sometimes she'd wait until he turned away. Other times, she'd accept the offering while he watched. With each passing day, the boundary between them thinned. He began to speak to her more, not just idle remarks, but small confessions. How he missed June, how the house was too quiet, how the world seemed to shrink a little more each year. The act of sharing food, of breaking bread with another living creature, did something to him. It softened the edges of his grief, made the mornings feel less endless. It gave him purpose, a reason to step outside, to pay attention. He noticed more: the shift in the wind, the first buds on the roses, the way the collie's fur darkened with the rain. He started humming to himself as he worked, the old tunes June used to play on the radio. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch with his coffee, he noticed the collie limping slightly, favoring her back paw. Concern flickered in his chest. He stood, walked to the fence, and knelt. "What happened there, girl?" he asked, peering through the slats. She didn't shy away. Instead, she sat, lifted her paw, and waited while he examined it from a distance. No blood, no obvious wound. Maybe just a twist or a stone, he decided. Take it easy, all right?" he said softly, surprised at the tenderness in his own voice. That night, as the house settled around him, Clayton found himself talking again to the empty room. But this time, there was a warmth in his words, a sense of connection that hadn't been there before. He realized he was smiling more, if only a little. The porch lights stayed on longer, casting a gentle glow over the backyard, guiding the collie to her spot by the fence. He wondered sometimes if the collie was lonely too, if she understood what it meant to wait for someone who never came back. He wondered if she missed someone the way he missed June. In those moments, as dawn broke and he offered another crumb or slice of meat, the world felt less divided, the fence between them less like a barrier and more like a line waiting to be crossed. And so, day after day, the old man and the collie shared their simple rituals. A crumb of bread, a quiet word, a companionable silence. Neither spoke, but both stayed. And slowly, almost without noticing, the loneliness in Clayton's world began to loosen, replaced by the small, persistent hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The shift between habit and healing is so subtle that most people don't notice it happening. Clayton certainly didn't. It began with a few more minutes each day at the fence, a handful of scraps saved from his plate, and a little more conversation, spoken aloud or whispered in the quiet corners of the garden. The collie, who he'd started to think of as Rosie, even though he'd never asked her name, became as much a part of his morning as the rising sun and the smell of damp Kentucky soil. At first, he told himself he was talking just to keep the silence away. "Old men do that," he muttered one afternoon as he pruned the roses. But his voice grew steadier each day, the words flowing more freely, until he realized he wasn't only talking to the collie, he was talking to June, or maybe he was talking to himself, or to the space in his life that had never quite filled in after she died. On a particularly warm morning in early October, Clayton stood in the garden, shears in hand, sweat already beading on his brow. Rosie was at her post, paws tucked under, her eyes tracking him as he moved from bush to bush. He glanced at her and grunted, "I suppose you're expecting a show, huh?" She flicked her tail once, the faintest suggestion of a grin crossing her muzzle. Clayton rolled his eyes, but he felt the corners of his mouth twitch. He snipped a few spent blooms, tossing them into the basket by his side, then paused, looking out over the fence as if he could see through time itself. He started talking about June, at first in pieces, fragments of stories that rose up like mist from the grass. She hated the color pink, you know? Wouldn't you can let me plant a single pink rose? Said it reminded her of cheap lipstick and prom dresses. Rosie cocked her head, listening. But she loved the red ones. Always said they looked like velvet in the morning sun. He wiped his brow and bent to weed around the base of a stubborn bush. The words kept coming, as if the act of gardening unlocked them from wherever he'd hidden them. "We used to dance out here, or right in the middle of the yard. Sunday mornings, usually, before the neighbors were awake. She'd put the radio on, and we'd waltz. Badly, I'll admit." He chuckled, the sound rough but genuine. She had 2 left feet, but she made up for it with enthusiasm. Sometimes the stories were lighter, about the time June tried to bake bread and filled the house with smoke, or how she always managed to win at cards, no matter how many times he accused her of cheating. Other times, the confessions were heavy, wrapped in grief and regret. "I should have called her sister more after she passed, kept in touch with the kids. But I just didn't know how. Felt like everything I said would have come out wrong." Rosie's presence became a balm. He didn't have to explain himself or apologize for the tears that sometimes slipped down his cheeks. She didn't look away, didn't fidget, or change the subject. She simply listened, her gaze steady and understanding. Rain or shine, Rosie never missed a day. If the weather was rough, she'd press close to the fence, nose poking through the slats, her fur speckled with raindrops. If it was cold, she'd curl up tight, breath steaming in the frosty morning air. No matter what, she was there, his silent confidant, the one creature who seemed to understand the language of loneliness. As the weeks passed, Clayton noticed himself changing in small ways. He lingered longer in the garden, found himself humming the songs June used to love. He started baking again, just to have something warm in the house. And once, he caught himself laughing, really laughing, at a memory of June slipping on wet grass and blaming it on defective boots. He became more attentive to the world outside the fence. He noticed the squirrels building nests in the maple trees, the way the sunlight hit the roses at noon, even the kids next door practicing basketball in their driveway. For the first time in years, he felt a faint but persistent urge to be part of something, to step out from behind the wall he'd built around his heart. One afternoon, as he planted bulbs for the spring, Rosie padded up to the fence and rested her head on her paws, eyes soulful. Clayton leaned on his trowel, feeling a wave of gratitude so strong it caught him off guard. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but you're good company," he said softly. "Better than most, really. June would have liked you." The porch light started staying on later into the evening. Instead of retreating inside at dusk, Clayton found himself sitting on the back steps, sipping coffee or tea, watching the stars come out. Sometimes he'd read aloud from one of June's old gardening books, just for the sound of another voice, and Rosie would listen with the patience of a priest. It didn't matter that the words weren't answered. It didn't matter. It ate that the fence was still there. Something inside him was healing, being stitched back together, one memory, one conversation, one wag of the tail at a time. One night, as a cool breeze rattled the branches, Clayton looked out across the yard and felt, for the first time in a long while, the urge to reach out. Not just to the collie, but to the world he'd shut out for so long. He picked up the phone, a thumb hovering over his daughter's number, but then set it down. Not yet. But soon, he promised himself. The collie, sensing his uncertainty, pressed her nose against the fence, her breath fogging the wood. Clayton smiled and knelt beside her. "Thank you, Rosie," he whispered, voice thick with emotion, "for listening, for staying." In the weeks that followed, the ritual held, a dance of words and silence, of sorrow and hope, played out in the narrow space between an old man, his garden, and the collie, who waited patiently on the other side of the fence. It wasn't until Rosie didn't show up that Clayton realized how deeply he had come to rely on her presence. That morning, the sky was bright, brushed clean by the rain from the night before. The world seemed fresh, the kind of morning June would have loved, when she'd open every window and let the air rush through the house. Clayton shuffled out onto the porch, cup of coffee warming his hands, and looked toward the fence, expecting to see the familiar tufted ears and gentle gaze. But the patch of grass beneath the fence was empty. He stood there for a moment, blinking in the sunlight, waiting for Rosie to come trotting around the corner. Maybe she was late. Maybe she'd found a rabbit or gotten distracted by a neighbor's barbecue. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, Clayton's routine began to unravel. He watered the roses more slowly than usual, pausing at each bush, as if hoping she might appear from behind the hydrangeas. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. "Dogs have lives too," he muttered, voice echoing in the emptiness. "She's not mine, anyway." He tried to focus on the garden, snipping spent blooms, pulling at stubborn weeds. But every few minutes, his eyes drifted back to the empty spot by the fence. The yard felt larger without her, as if her absence had sucked out some vital warmth, leaving only shadows and silence behind. That afternoon, he caught himself lingering by the fence, peering through the slats into the neighbor's yard. No sign of her. He felt foolish, like an old man losing his grip. He busied himself with chores, swept the porch, checked the gutters, polished the brass house numbers for no reason at all. But none of it filled the hollow feeling creeping into his chest. The next morning was worse. He woke before dawn, heart pounding with hope, and hurried to the kitchen window. No movement. The grass by the fence remained untouched, save for a few scattered feathers from the sparrows. Clayton set out his usual scraps anyway, just in case. He sat on the steps, clutching his mug, watching the sun rise as the world came alive around him. Still, no Rosie. He moved through the day in a fog. The mailman waved as he passed, but Clayton barely noticed. Mrs. Simmons called over the fence, asking if he was all right, and he responded with a distracted nod, too embarrassed to explain the source of his distraction. How could he tell anyone that a neighbor's dog had become the anchor of his days? How could he explain that her absence hurt more than most of the human disappointments he'd endured? The house felt emptier than it had in years. He wandered from room to room, unable to settle. He tried to read, but the words swam before his eyes. He made dinner, grilled cheese, and tomato soup, but pushed the plate away after a few bites. The silence pressed in, thick and relentless. Every creak of the house made him turn, expecting the jingle of Rosie's collar, the gentle tap of her paws at the back door. As night fell, Clayton sat in his chair by the window, watching the moon cast long shadows across the backyard. He caught himself whispering to the darkness. "Where'd you go, girl?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. There was no answer, only the sigh of wind through the trees and the distant hum of traffic. He dreamed of June that night, her voice soft, her laughter curling through the house. In the dream, she was dancing barefoot in the garden, arms outstretched, beckoning him to join her. But as he reached for her, she faded into mist, and he woke alone, the ache in his chest sharper than ever. On the third day of Rosie's absence, Clayton's worry hardened into something like panic. He tried to shake it off, to convince himself she'd be back, but the doubt gnawed at him. What if something had happened to her? What if she'd run away, or been taken in by someone else? What if she'd decided, in the end, that he wasn't worth coming back for? The uncertainty was worse than any answer. He found himself standing at the fence, hand resting on the weathered wood, listening for any sound, a bark, a whine, the rustle of paws in the grass. But the world remained stubbornly silent. He thought about asking the neighbors, but the idea made him feel exposed. He was afraid they'd see through him, see how lonely he was, how much he'd come to depend on the simple, wordless companionship of a dog who wasn't even his. The old pride, stubborn as ever, kept him rooted to his own side of the fence. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table, Clayton realized how much Rosie had changed his world. He missed the comfort of her gaze, the way she listened without judgment, the steady rhythm of her presence. He missed talking to her about June, missed the way she made the empty house feel almost full. He'd convinced himself that solitude was a choice, but now he saw it for what it was. A prison built from grief and habit, one that Rosie had quietly unlocked, one gentle look at a time. The hours crawled by. He drifted off in his chair, startled awake by a dream of barking, only to find the house still silent. He tried to tell himself he didn't care, that he was fine on his own, but the words rang hollow in the empty room. When morning came, he went through the motions. Coffee, roses, a plate of scraps by the fence, clinging to the hope that today would be different. But the spot by the fence remained empty. The only sign of Rosie, a faint depression in the grass where she used to lie. The silence felt heavier than it had in years, a weight pressing down on his chest. Clayton stood in the yard, the sun rising behind him, and finally allowed himself to admit the truth. He missed her. He missed the quiet company, the shared rituals, the sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he'd once believed. He pressed his hand to the fence, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingers, and whispered, "Come back soon, Rosie." His words floated on the morning air, carried away on a hope he wasn't sure he deserved. And for the first time since June had passed, Clayton found himself praying. Not for himself, not even for June, but for the safe return of a dog who had somehow become the heartbeat of his days. Clayton had never thought of himself as the kind of man who worried about other people's business. For most of his life, he'd kept to himself, minding his own affairs, letting the world swirl past on the other side of a closed door. But after 3 days with no sign of Rosie, that hard shell began to crack. He found himself standing at the back fence, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn jeans, staring at the empty grass with a sense of longing that surprised him. Every little noise set his heart racing. Was that the jingle of a collar, the soft brush of fur against wood? And at each time, he was disappointed. Just a squirrel darting up the maple, or the wind rustling through the hydrangeas. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that maybe, just maybe, he'd let himself care too much. On the fourth morning, Clayton resolved to do something he hadn't done in years. Walk over to the neighbor's house and ask. The thought made him anxious. He was an old man, and old men, in his mind, didn't go poking around, didn't admit they missed a dog that wasn't even theirs. But pride had given way to worry, and the silence in his house was too much to bear. He put on his cleanest shirt, ran a comb through his hair, and practiced what he'd say in front of the bathroom mirror. It all sounded foolish, but he didn't care. The need to know outweighed the risk of embarrassment. With a deep breath, he stepped out his front door, walked down the cracked path, and knocked at the neighbor's. It was the house next door, but somehow the short walk felt like a journey across a continent. The garden was in disarray, overgrown with weeds. The shutters were closed, a for sale sign leaning crookedly in the yard. Clayton's heart sank. He'd barely registered the sign before, just another piece of background noise. Now it felt ominous. He knocked. No answer. He waited, hearing only the distant bark of a dog blocks away. He was about to turn back when a car pulled up in the driveway next door, tires crunching on the gravel. Out stepped a young woman, no more than 30, carrying a grocery bag and a phone tucked under her chin. She glanced at him, startled but polite. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice brisk. Clayton hesitated. Sorry to bother you, ma'am. I live next door, Clayton. I was just, I used to see a collie, a dog, by the fence every morning. Haven't seen her lately, and I was wondering if she was all right. Is she yours?" The young woman shook her head. "Oh, Rosie? No, she's not mine. I just moved in 2 days ago." She shifted her grocery bag. "But I think the people who lived here before, they started moving out last week. Messy divorce, I heard. A lot of noise, a lot of boxes. Haven't seen them since Thursday." Clayton felt a cold knot twist in his chest. "And the dog?" She softened a little at his concern. "I did see her, actually. The collie, right? She's been around. Scratched at the fence a few times. I heard her whine the other night. She even slept in our yard 2 nights ago. We figured she was waiting for something or someone." She smiled gently. She seemed lonely. Clayton's relief was immediate, but it was quickly chased by a new kind of worry. Rosie was still here, but lost, confused, and alone, just like him. He thanked the woman, feeling awkward and exposed. "Sorry to bother you. I just, she's a good dog, that's all." She nodded. "If I see her, I'll let you know. Maybe leave out some food for her. She seemed hungry." Clayton managed a thin smile and turned away, heart pounding in his chest. He felt ridiculous, a grown man, nearly 75, asking after a neighbor's dog. But as he walked back to his yard, the shame faded, replaced by determination. Rosie hadn't left. She was still searching, still waiting. That afternoon, he set out a plate by the fence. A little chicken, some cheese, even half a biscuit. He checked it every hour, hoping for signs, a paw print, a lick, any proof she'd been there. The food stayed untouched for hours until dusk, when he finally caught sight of her. Rosie moved quietly, almost ghost-like, nose close to the ground, tail low. She circled the yard, pausing at the fence. For a moment she just stood there, as if deciding whether it was safe to cross an invisible line. Clayton watched from the porch, barely breathing, afraid any movement would send her running. "Rosie," he called softly, his voice cracked from disuse, gentle as a prayer. She looked up, ears perking, and took a tentative step toward him. She sniffed the plate, then as slowly began to eat, eyes never leaving his face. Clayton felt tears sting the corners of his eyes. He didn't move, just watched, grateful for the simple miracle of her return. When she'd finished, she lingered by the fence, pressing her nose through the slats, tail giving a tentative wag. He crouched down, reaching a hand through the gap. She leaned closer, letting him scratch behind her ear, fur soft beneath his calloused fingers. "It's all right, girl," he whispered. "You're not alone." That night, Clayton left the porch light on. He propped the back door open a crack, just in case. The house didn't feel quite as empty, the silence not so crushing. Rosie was out there, waiting, searching, surviving, and he was waiting too. Two lost souls on either side of a fence, slowly learning that sometimes reaching out is the bravest thing you can do. Over the next couple of days, Clayton made a point to check on Rosie at every opportunity. He'd see her wandering the block, sometimes sleeping in the tall grass next to the neighbor's shed, sometimes pacing by the old maple. He started asking around, at the corner store, the post office, even Mrs. Simmons. Everyone had seen the collie. Everyone wondered who she belonged to. But no one claimed her. She was nobody's dog now, and yet, somehow, she was his. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world gold, Rosie returned to the fence. Clayton sat on the steps, waiting. He didn't call her, didn't try to coax her closer. He just waited, trusting that she'd come in her own time. When she finally pressed her head against the fence, Clayton reached out, running his fingers through her fur. He didn't say much. Words felt unnecessary, but the meaning was clear. The world had changed for both of them, but maybe, just maybe, they could face it together. As the stars appeared overhead, Clayton sat quietly, Rosie beside him, the empty house no longer quite so empty, the long, hard silence softened by the companionship of a friend who understood what it meant to wait and to hope. The days since Rosie's disappearance and tentative reappearances had felt like living in slow motion. Each morning, Clayton rose with the same ache in his knees and the same hope in his chest, scanning the yard and the fence for a sign of the collie. His world, once reduced to routine, then fractured by loss, was now suspended in anxious anticipation. He found himself checking the window compulsively, wandering the yard at odd hours, calling softly into the dusk, "Rosie," and waiting for any sound of paws or wagging tail. The new neighbor, the young woman with the steady eyes and quick smile, had kept her word. She left water bowls and scraps in her backyard, and sometimes she and Clayton would exchange updates over the fence in the late afternoon. "She was here last night," the neighbor would say. "Slept near the shed, right where you can see your house." There was always a pause, a silent recognition that both of them were rooting for the same small hope, Rosie's safe return. Then, on an evening when the first hints of frost painted the grass silver and the air held the promise of winter, Clayton was startled by a knock at his front door. He paused, heart pounding. Hardly anyone knocked on his door these days, solicitors mostly, or delivery men. The knock came again, firmer this time. He shuffled down the hall and opened it. On his porch stood the young neighbor, her cheeks red from the cold, her dark hair pulled back under a wool hat. By her side, tail low but wagging hopefully, was Rosie. "She wouldn't stay," the neighbor said, without preamble. Her breath curled in the cold air. "I tried to keep her in the yard, but she kept coming back to your side, scratching at the fence. I thought, well, maybe she's looking for you." Clayton stood frozen, words stuck in his throat. Rosie looked up at him, her brown eyes soft, ears perked, body vibrating with a hope that mirrored his own. He knelt, reaching out a trembling hand. Rosie pressed her head against his leg, leaning into him, breathing out a small sigh as if she, too, had been holding her breath for days. He stroked her fur, feeling the warmth, the reality of her presence. He hadn't realized how much he needed that gentle weight, that quiet companionship. "So you pick me, huh?" he said, voice thick with feeling. Rosie looked up and licked his hand, a single sure gesture. Clayton smiled, a real, unguarded smile that made him look years younger. The neighbor shifted, glancing down at the dog and back up at Clayton. "She really does seem to love you. I think she's chosen her new home." He stood, a little embarrassed, but grateful. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to go to all that trouble." She shrugged. "Didn't feel like trouble. We all need a friend sometimes, right?" There was a moment of silence, easy and companionable. Then she smiled, gave Rosie one last scratch behind the ears, and waved. "You two take care of each other." Clayton watched her go, then looked down at Rosie, who gazed back as if awaiting his verdict. He hesitated, unsure of what to do next. For so long, his life had been a careful balancing act, a series of rituals designed to hold the world at bay. Now, standing on his porch in the gathering dusk, he felt something shift. The fence, once a symbol of separation, seemed less like a barrier, more like an invitation. He led Rosie inside, pausing as she sniffed around the threshold, cautious but curious. The house, which had felt so cavernous and empty, now hummed with new energy. Clayton watched as Rosie wandered from room to room, nose to the floor, tail wagging gently. She paused in the kitchen, looking up at him expectantly. He smiled and fetched a bowl, filling it with water, then rummaged in the fridge for some leftover roast chicken. While Rosie ate, Clayton sat at the kitchen table, watching her. He found himself talking, not the tentative, one-sided conversations he'd shared with her in the garden, but real words, full sentences. He told her about June's recipe for chicken pot pie, about the time he and June got caught in a thunderstorm while walking home from a neighbor's party, about how he'd never really liked the color of the kitchen curtains, but had left them up anyway, out of habit. Rosie listened, ears twitching at the sound of his voice, her presence steady and reassuring. When she finished eating, she patted over and laid her head on his knee, her eyes closing in contentment. Clayton reached down and scratched behind her ears, marveling at the simplicity of her trust. That night, as darkness crept across the house and the world outside faded into shadow, Clayton left the bedroom door open. Rosie hesitated for a moment, then leaped up onto the foot of the bed, curling herself into a tight ball. He laughed, a real laugh, echoing in the quiet, and pulled an old blanket from the closet to drape over her. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. The silence was different now, softer, gentler, threaded through with hope. As the next morning, Clayton found himself rising earlier than usual, eager to share the sunrise with his new companion. He brewed 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one cooled and poured into a bowl for Rosie, though she only sniffed at it before drinking her water. Together, they sat on the porch, watching the world wake up. Neighbors walking by waved, their faces curious but friendly. Rosie greeted them with a polite wag of her tail, her posture calm and confident. Clayton found himself returning the waves, even calling out a good morning now and then. The world, which had seemed so small and closed, felt suddenly larger, brighter, full of possibility. Rosie became a fixture at his side, following him from room to room, lying at his feet as he read the paper, nosing him gently when it was time for a walk. They developed new routines, strolls around the block, visits to the park, even a stop at the local cafe where the owner slipped Rosie treats behind the counter. Each day, Clayton felt a little more like himself, a self he'd thought lost with June, now slowly returning, rebuilt with every wag of Rosie's tail and every shared silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Clayton knelt beside Rosie in the garden. "You know," he said quietly, voice filled with gratitude, I think June would have liked you." She always said life was better with a friend. Rosie leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder. And for the first time in a long while, Clayton felt truly at home. Not just in his house, but in the world. The next morning broke clear and bright, the sky a rare, unbroken blue that only seemed to show up when summer gave way to fall. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the faded kitchen tiles and painting golden rectangles across the floor. Clayton moved through his house with an energy he hadn't felt in years, humming tunelessly as he made coffee and cracked eggs into a skillet. There was an anticipation in the air, an excitement that buzzed at the edges of his routine and threatened to spill over into something new. Rosie padded quietly after him, her nails clicking gently on the hardwood as she explored her new kingdom. She watched every move he made, eyes bright with curiosity and trust. When he sat at the table, she sat at his feet. When he stepped outside, she followed, tail wagging as if to say, "What's next?" It was as if the whole house was waking up from a long, silent slumber. The dust motes in the sunlight spun like tiny dancers. The old clock ticked with renewed purpose. Even the roses by the fence, heavy with late blooms, seemed to lift their heads higher in the gentle breeze. After breakfast, Clayton found himself lingering by the back door, staring at the fence that had, for so long, been both boundary and barrier. For weeks, months even, he'd regarded that fence as the edge of his world, a line drawn between what he could handle and everything he let go. But today, with Rosie at his side, it looked different. Less like a wall, more like a possibility. He slipped on his old garden boots, pulled a faded flannel over his shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. Rosie followed, trotting happily through the dew-wet grass. Clayton paused at the gate. Just a simple wooden latch, worn smooth from years of weather and worry. His hand hovered over it, uncertain. He glanced down at Rosie, who looked up, tail still, waiting. For a long moment, Clayton just stood there, the latch cool beneath his fingers. He remembered all the mornings he'd watched Rosie from the other side, both of them hesitant, both keeping their distance. He remembered the ache of loss, the heaviness of silence, and the comfort of her steady, wordless companionship. The fence had protected him, but it had also kept him closed off. From his neighbors, from his family, and from the living world beyond his grief. With a quiet breath, Clayton unlatched the gate. It swung open with a soft, creaking protest. Now, Rosie didn't hesitate. She stepped through, head held high, as if she'd always belonged on this side. She circled the yard, sniffing every corner, and bounded up onto the porch, nose nudging the door. Clayton laughed, a sound he barely recognized as his own. "Well, come on in then. This is your home, too." He set a fresh bowl of water on the porch and pulled a box of treats from the kitchen. Rosie accepted her prize with polite excitement, then sprawled on the porch steps, content as a queen, surveying her realm. Clayton settled beside her, mug in hand, watching the world wake up around them. The house changed in small but meaningful ways. Doors that had always been kept closed were now left open. A blanket found its place beside the door, a leash hung on the porch hook, and muddy paw prints became a regular feature on the kitchen floor. Rosie's toys, gathered from garage sales and thrift stores, ended up scattered through every room. The porch light, once rarely used, now shone each night as a beacon, welcoming Rosie home from her evening patrols around the yard. The silence that had once filled the house was softer now, threaded with the gentle rhythm of Rosie's breathing, the occasional thump of her tail, and the low rumble of her contented sighs. Clayton found himself talking more, telling stories about June and his children, about the old days at the garage, and about hopes he'd long ago tucked away. Rosie listened, her presence steady and reassuring, her eyes full of patient understanding. Clayton's neighbors noticed the change, too. Mrs. Simmons stopped by with a tin of cookies, smiling at the sight of Rosie, curled up by the roses. "Looks like you've got yourself a real companion there, Mr. Clayton," she said. He nodded, pride and gratitude swelling in his chest. "She's a good dog, best I've ever known." He found himself venturing out more. Grocery runs became less daunting, the walk to the mailbox less lonely. Sometimes he and Rosie walked to the park, where children played and other dog owners gathered in friendly clusters. People greeted him by name, asked about Rosie, and shared their own stories. The world, once small and shuttered, was opening up. But the most meaningful change was inside Clayton himself. The routines he'd clung to for comfort became opportunities for connection. Watering the roses was now a shared ritual, Rosie trotting at his side, occasionally stopping to sniff a bloom or chase a butterfly. Evenings on the porch turned into quiet conversations, the sky painted with the colors of sunset, Rosie's head resting on his knee. There were still hard days, moments when the weight of loss pressed in, when he missed June so much it hurt to breathe. But Rosie was always there, her presence a gentle reminder that grief and love could exist side by side. That healing wasn't about forgetting, but about letting new joys take root in the soil of old sorrows. One morning, as Clayton sipped his coffee on the porch and Rosie dozed at his feet, he glanced at the open gate. The sight filled him with quiet satisfaction, a symbol not just of welcome, but of readiness. He realized that the fence had never been about keeping others out. It was about giving himself the space and time he needed until he was ready to open up again. Rosie stirred, lifting her head to nuzzle his hand. Clayton smiled, scratching behind her ears. "Guess we're both learning how to let people in," he murmured. Inside, the house was still, but it was no longer empty. The rooms echoed with memories and new laughter, the kitchen filled with the scent of fresh coffee and dog biscuits. The garden, once a place of solitude, was now alive with possibility. And through it all, the gate remained open, an invitation to hope, to healing, and to whatever might come next. It's remarkable, Clayton thought, how the presence of a dog could transform an entire house. Not just the physical space, but the spirit, the air, even the light seemed different with Rosie there. She was everywhere now, her quiet energy seeping into the walls and floors, into the fabric of his days. In the weeks since he'd opened the gate and let her into his home, the old stillness had been replaced by a gentle, steady pulse, a new rhythm of life. Mornings became a shared adventure. Instead of shuffling through the house alone, Clayton awoke to Rosie's nose nudging his hand, her tail thumping against the blankets. She insisted on a walk before breakfast, pulling him, reluctant at first, but grateful in the end, out into the cool dawn. The neighborhood came alive around them, children waiting for the school bus, joggers waving hello, even Mrs. Simmons on her porch with her ever-present mug of tea. Clayton found himself waving back, nodding, even exchanging a few words. Rosie trotted at his side, proud and calm, introducing him to a world he'd once ignored. Inside, the changes were even more profound. Rosie claimed her spots with confidence, a blanket by the door, a sunny patch on the living room rug, the foot of the bed at night. Her leash hung beside the back door, always ready for the next adventure. Clayton started opening the curtains each morning, letting the sun pour in. He began to notice the details he'd long ignored, the dust on the windowsills, the faded photographs on the mantel, the way the hardwood gleamed when the light hit it just so. Clayton's voice, once so rarely used, found new purpose. He spoke to Rosie constantly, commenting on the weather, the flavor of his coffee, the progress of the roses outside. He read aloud from the newspaper, sometimes stumbling over the words, but always rewarded with Rosie's attentive gaze. He hummed old songs while washing dishes, the same tunes June once sang as she baked bread or tended her plants. The house echoed with the sound of living. Perhaps the most remarkable change was in the way others responded. The neighbors who had once given Clayton a wide berth now lingered in conversation at the fence. Mrs. Simmons often stopped by with stories about her grandchildren or a new recipe she wanted to share. The mail carrier, a cheerful young man named Travis, brought extra dog treats in his pocket, tossing them to Rosie with a grin. Children from down the block began to wave at Clayton, calling out greetings as they zipped by on bikes or scooters. Rosie, patient and gentle, became a favorite. Sometimes, when the weather was warm, the neighborhood kids would gather in Clayton's yard, tossing a ball for Rosie and giggling as she chased it with unrestrained joy. Their laughter carried through the open windows, bouncing off the old walls and settling in every quiet corner of the house. One afternoon, after a particularly lively game of fetch, Clayton found himself sitting on the porch with Mrs. Simmons and two of the children, sipping lemonade and swapping stories. He realized, with a jolt of surprise, that he was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy. For the first time in years, Rosie lay at his feet, panting softly, her head on his shoe. Clayton reached down and scratched her ears, grateful for the warmth of her body and the steady beat of her heart. The shift inside him was subtle, but profound. The routines he'd once clung to, out of loneliness, now became acts of connection. He started to call his daughter more often, sometimes just to leave a message. The first time, he stumbled over his words, unsure of what to say. "Got a dog now," he finally managed, voice gruff. "Thought you ought to know." There was a long pause, then a soft, surprised laugh from the other end. "I'm glad, Dad. Really glad." Soon after, his daughter came to visit. She arrived with a nervous smile and a plate of brownies, her two children in tow. Rosie greeted them with gentle curiosity, and the kids were instantly smitten. The house filled with the sound of their laughter, the thud of their running feet, the excited barking as Rosie chased after them in the yard. Clayton watched from the porch, tears prickling his eyes, his heart so full he thought it might burst. That evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon and the world grew quiet, Clayton and his daughter sat on the steps, sharing memories of June, the garden, and days long gone. For the first time, he spoke about the loneliness, about how Rosie had found him and filled a space he didn't know could be healed. His daughter listened, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes shining with understanding. After they left, the house felt warm and alive, filled with echoes of family and laughter. Rosie curled up beside his chair, sighing contentedly. Clayton stroked her soft fur, whispering, "Thank you, girl. You brought them back to me." She thumped her tail, eyes closing in trust and happiness. The days that followed were bright and busy. Clayton kept the windows open, let the breeze carry the scent of roses and cut grass through every room. He baked bread, sharing loaves with the neighbors. He invited Mrs. Simmons for tea, helped the kids with their homework, learned the names of every dog on the block. He started a new flower bed with Rosie at his side. Their shared labor transforming the garden into a living tribute to hope and renewal. At night, when the world was quiet and the stars burned overhead, Clayton would sit on the porch with Rosie at his feet, listening to the soft sounds of life around him. The loneliness was still there, sometimes rising up without warning, but it no longer ruled him. It was simply another part of the tapestry, a thread woven among laughter, companionship, and the unspoken promise that the best days might still lie ahead. As autumn deepened, the roses faded and leaves drifted across the yard. Clayton felt a sense of peace settle over him, gentle as a blessing. The house, once a place of sorrow and solitude, had awakened. Its windows glowed warm against the twilight, the fence no longer a boundary, but a bridge. Rosie, faithful and true, was his constant companion, the heartbeat of his home. And so, as the world turned and seasons changed, Clayton knew that he was no longer alone. The house had come alive, and so had he. The days grew shorter, the air sharpened, and autumn gold settled over Lexington. With Rosie at his side, Clayton welcomed the change, watching the slow parade of seasons from his favorite seat on the porch. Each morning he'd rise before the sun, sip his coffee in the gentle hush, and listen to the rhythmic breathing of his companion. Some days, the memories of June drifted close. Her laughter on the wind, her soft voice in the roses. But for the first time, those memories brought comfort instead of pain. He tended his roses faithfully, hands weathered but sure, whispering to them as June once did. Rosie shadowed him, sometimes dozing in the sun, sometimes chasing after a drifting leaf. Her presence was both a balm and a steadying anchor, a living reminder that healing came not by forgetting, but by opening the heart again. Just a crack at a time. The house itself bore the marks of this new chapter. The windows, once shut tight, were now almost always open, filling the rooms with light and laughter. There were muddy paw prints in the hallway, a water bowl by the back door, and a leash hanging from the old brass hook. Rosie's toys, chewed, battered, beloved, were scattered about as evidence that life, in all its unpredictable glory, had returned. Neighbors stopped by more often now, always greeted by Rosie's gentle tail wags and Clayton's newfound warmth. There were impromptu gatherings on the porch, shared meals, stories traded over mugs of coffee or glasses of sweet tea. Evenings were no longer spent in silence, but filled with the easy cadence of conversation and the kind of laughter that left your ribs aching. Clayton began to understand that the fence, so long a symbol of his solitude, had become something else entirely. Oh, a meeting place, a bridge, a line meant not for keeping out but for inviting in. One crisp afternoon, his daughter returned with her own family, drawn by the promise of home-baked bread and the irresistible pull of Rosie's welcome. She found her father more open, less weighed down by sorrow. They walked together in the garden, hands brushing over the faded petals, their conversation easy and honest. When they hugged goodbye, it was with a promise to come back soon, and the knowledge that they truly meant it. Rosie became the heartbeat of the household. She was there for every small joy and every minor setback, her loyalty a thread weaving together each day. She curled up beside Clayton as he read, napped at his feet as he watched Old Western, and waited patiently as he worked in the garden. Their bond deepened in the quiet moments, a look exchanged across the kitchen, the soft weight of her head on his lap, the silent comfort of shared sunsets. The roses faded and returned, seasons turning in their unhurried way. Clayton marked time not by holidays or anniversaries, but by the quiet rhythms of daily life. The way Rosie nudged him when it was time for a walk, the smell of rain on the soil, the burst of color each spring, when the garden awoke once more. He found that grief, like the weather, ebbed and flowed, but he was no longer afraid of the storm. With Rosie, he learned to weather it. Sometimes, as twilight settled, Clayton would sit on the porch, Rosie pressed close, and watch the children of the neighborhood chase fireflies or roll in piles of autumn leaves. He'd wave to Mrs. Simmons, call out a greeting to Travis the mailman, and feel the warmth of belonging settle in his chest. For so long he'd believed that fences existed to keep the world out. Now he saw the truth. Sometimes fences simply give us space until we're ready to open them. One evening, after the last light had faded and the sky glimmered with stars, Clayton ran his hand over Rosie's fur and let his thoughts wander. He thought about June, about love and loss, about the slow, patient work of healing. He thought about the Collie, who had waited on the other side of a fence until he was ready, and about the courage it took for both of them to take that first tentative step forward. As he rose to go inside, he paused at the open gate. The air was cool and sweet, full of the scents of earth and leaves and distant wood smoke. Rosie followed, pausing just long enough to glance back at the street, her gaze steady and calm. Clayton smiled and whispered, "Come on, girl, time to go home." Inside, the house glowed, soft light spilling from the kitchen, laughter echoing in the hallway, the promise of another day waiting just beyond the dawn. Rosie curled up by the door, and Clayton settled into his chair, heart full. The fence still stood, weathered and strong, but it was no longer a wall. It was a reminder. Some boundaries protect, and some simply give us time. In the end, the courage to open the gate, to let love in and let life back, was the only thing that mattered. As the seasons continued to turn, Clayton tended his roses, drank his coffee, and watched the world with Rosie at his side. Together, they proved that healing isn't about mending what's broken, but about building something new in its place. And every day, as the sun rose over the fence, Clayton felt gratitude for the silence, for the companionship, for the simple miracle of a gate swinging open, underscore, 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 underscore. If this story opens something in you, pass it on. And subscribe for more stories that speak through silence.